Hello, family. How are you today? My name is Quanisha Johnson. I'm a licensed counselor and educator, and I am very excited to be presenting to you a new topic for the next 4 weeks. We've been talking about a different topic related to family. We discussed children in particular, relationships, the Black woman, and so we are now embarking upon a new topic for the next 4 weeks. And so I am going to just share with you what we're going to be talking about today. And today's topic is going to be we are going to be talking about unpacking racial identity and trauma. Once again, the conversation for the next 4 weeks is going to be about racial identity and the trauma. And so today, specifically, session one, we're going to be focusing on where it all began, a look at childhood trauma. We want to start at the root. Where did everything begin? You know, if you're listening to this today or whenever you listen to it, you know, and you're an adult, you are an adult who was once a child. That's the thing that we all have in common. You know, development looks different, but we were all as adults once children. And so we can now reflect on positive experiences that molded us and negative experiences that molded us, especially if you are a Black person. So that racial identity, how you see yourself, how others see you. We want to talk today about trauma, and trauma in the context also of race and what that looks like for our children, and in relation to adulthood, the adults that we've become. What does that look like? How does that impact us? How did that impact us? Okay, so let's talk about what trauma is. So we hear that phrase a lot. You know, someone says they're traumatized or they've gone through a traumatic experience. But what exactly is trauma? So trauma refers to the intense and overwhelming experience that involves a serious loss, threat, or harm to a person's physical and or emotional well-being. I think it's very important to highlight it's that part of it that says not just serious loss, but threat or harm. So when we think of the word threat, if someone were to threaten someone, it's not necessarily that they're doing something, but they're saying something is going to happen as a result of something else. And so it's that threat or harm, and not only to your physical, but also to your emotional well-being. So if we want to simplify it, trauma can also be a threat to your well-being. The experiences can occur at any time in a person's life. And sometimes with trauma, there's a single event situation, or trauma may be repeated over many years. And I'll give some examples, or an example to that. Now, if we think about 9/11 is an example I'll give, very, very traumatic event that impacted so many people. And so if you were someone, now I know if you were alive during the time of 9/11, I remember I was in college. I wasn't in the towers or in the city. And so I didn't have a direct impact, but watching it over and over again, seeing people suffering was very traumatic for me. And so ultimately, if someone was in the city or was a survivor, escaped, and that was, although there's an impact of that over time, absolutely, for that person, we would call that a single traumatic event. So they were in that building, they were in the towers, or they were in the city running for their lives because they didn't know what was happening. And so that's an event. Not the day of September 11th was a single traumatic event If we want to talk about repeated over many years, we may think about someone being sexually abused. And I know we've all heard of stories in which someone is sexually abused and they said the abuse began, they remember when they were 7 and it continued until they were 15. So that is a type of traumatic event or traumatic incident that or experience that occurred repeatedly over many years. So trauma can look different. It could be that one major event. What they both have in common is that they still have long-term impact. So just because something happened once versus something happening over time, there's still a long-term impact to both situations. These trauma experiences will overwhelm that person's ability to cope. You don't have a sense of your coping skills because it's so overwhelming, and that your normal day-to-day tools that are in your toolbox, even if you're a child, you don't have them because the experience is so psychologically, emotionally, physically overwhelming that it takes those abilities away. So with trauma, a person will not have those tools or skills, and so as a result, they have a hard time, figuring out what to do in the short term, and they do things. What to do that's a long-term impact of coping, and they end up having resources, and they're calling it resources that for the short run that may cause serious harm over time. And so it's the idea of, if I am overwhelmed by this traumatic experience, I might find ways to cope that may not be healthy, but for the short term, it's something that I need to do in order to get by, to make it, but it has a long-term deleterious impact to the situation or to my well-being. So the response to trauma can depend on just different factors. And I also want to repeat or reiterate, just when we talk about trauma, and I talked about physical well-being, emotional well-being, a threat or harm, a serious loss. All trauma events, as I said, they're not always physical. Like your physical well-being is not at risk, but it is, those situations are not always going to be violent. Because I remember when I wasn't, in the place that I am, and learning about it when I was much younger, always thinking about a traumatic event being something that was going to only cause physical harm. It was so serious. You're involved in some type of natural disaster, and that was the example of trauma. It doesn't always, or you were involved in a shooting. Absolutely traumatic events, but traumatic events aren't always violent, and they don't always look that way. And in a lot of cases, when we think about trauma, it doesn't, and today we're talking about childhood trauma, it doesn't always have to be directed towards the individual or the child. You can witness something. So as I stated earlier with 9/11, it was very, very traumatic for many people, and they were not physically there. They weren't in New York City, they were in other states, but to watch everything play out, to feel a threat, feel threatened, feel that feeling is traumatic, So it doesn't always have to be direct. It can be something indirect. Remember that threat, that threat of loss, that threat of harm. So the response to these situations, they can be different, and they depend on multiple factors. So for one, the response can depend on the age and stage of development of that child. Like how old, when a child's involved in a traumatic event or a series of traumatic events, how old are they? That makes a difference. The personality, we all have different personalities, if if you're an adult and you're watching this, and think about, your personality that was formulated, it started being formulated when you were younger, and what your personality was, what your temperament was. So how these factors make a difference in how we respond to it. People who had a prior history of trauma, it makes a difference as well, because that repeated, or you're already, and we'll talk about a little bit later, that hypervigilance when you're in a traumatic situation or you have a traumatic experience. So imagine you're already heightened, right? And then you experience something again, and you're already in a heightened state and hypervigilant. And so your response may differ because of prior situations. And when I say environment, the question is that when you're going, when a child, if we're talking about children, or when you were a child, what was your environment like? What environment were you in terms of how you were supported? What were the supports in place? Are there supports in your school, right? So if you go through something at school, what are the supportive adults? So that environmental piece is very, very important, because think about the idea of a child going through something or having traumatic experiences, and they don't have the proper supports in place. They don't have a family that's supportive, or teachers, or community. And so that environmental piece can really, really make a difference in how someone responds. Specifically, we're talking about children, how children respond to trauma. And then the trauma response can also depend on, the experience in terms of who were you around? Was there someone that violated you or harmed you in some way? And what was your relationship to them? So if you, for an example, were physically abused by a parent, it has a bearing on, or a weight on, your response, because of that relationship of that person that's supposed to be your caregiver. So you may respond differently to abuse from someone who you have a specific or certain relationship with. In terms of, I'll go back a little bit to I want to touch on the age and stage of development, just understanding that when you experience, or a child experiences something traumatic from the ages of birth, because you can experience traumatic events and you can be an infant. From about birth to 5 years old, it really, because think about what happens during that developmental stage, and just think about a baby in general. Baby's born, and think about how things are going so fast. Like they come out and they're sleeping, and you're like, I can't wait till they open their eyes more and they're awake. They're sleeping, and then all of a sudden they're rolling over. Then they're battling, and then all of these stages, and it's moving and moving. The brain is going and going and going. So you're experiencing, let's say, from birth to 5, for that development, you see, the developing leaps and bounds, getting bigger, just, doing more things and growing, learning, absorbing their environment. So between that time, birth to 5 years old, right before, as you see, school age, when there is a traumatic situation, it interferes with development. It interferes with executive functioning skills, and it can show up, the trauma, as cognitive delays in that child. So a child experiencing between that very pivotal age, developmental age, birth and 5, they're highly impacted, and that trauma, the response may be delays in their cognition and their behaviors. So this is just FYI, for your information, just for you to understand. Trauma is common. And so sometimes we live in this shame, this fear, this anxiety, that we are the only people that, we look at our families, and that shame piece is so big, because we think about our childhood, and sometimes, like I said, we don't share And we feel isolated because we had this situation, this traumatic situation, or this ongoing, situation, and we feel like it's just us, and we're so ashamed. And so just wanting everyone to understand that experiencing trauma, we don't want it to be common. We want everyone, when you're a child, we want children to have the healthiest and happiest experience growing up, because it's such a pivotal time. That's why our conversation today is like where it all began. Everything begins in childhood, at inception, right? We think about you're conceived, you're born, you're here, and then you just, the excitement of a baby coming in, just the joy and watching them grow up and get their little two teeth and walk and talk. And so the desire is that children who are so innocent, and often they feel so powerless, for them to go through things that just shape who they are as adults, that harm them. It's devastating. So we're talking about what happens with children. And when I say it's common. And we have to understand trauma is common, especially in the Black community, especially if we really, really look at what we've experienced, what we are experiencing, right? The residual effects of slavery and everything, of Jim Crow, of segregation and systemic racism and everything going on, these traumatic experiences. And we talked about this a few months ago, about epigenetic trauma, right? What's passed down, how we deal with it, how we cope with it. And so ultimately, we have and are experiencing trauma. And remember, it's not always a direct. So I don't have to experience trauma. It doesn't mean that I'm physically harmed. I could witness something. There could be a threat. The threat of serious loss or harm is traumatic. And childhood trauma, as I said a minute ago, when we talk about what happens in childhood, when a child goes through these situations, they're just different than we are. They're not adults yet. And so they feel helpless. They already, as I stated, feel like they don't have power, because someone decides where you're going, what you're wearing, what you're doing, who you're with, what you're eating. And so those things are a part of your child. You have to do those things. But when they go through something and they can't defend themselves, or they have no choice but to be there. So a child who's abused, but they have to go to this person's house to be cared for, watching that person's harming them. But they have to go because their caregiver has to work. So what do? So ultimately, it is just common in our community, and a child feels helpless. I just want to say today, in talking about this is to understand how children experience it, but it really, really is for adults to look at themselves, where they are, their current experiences, their current coping skills, and then to make that connection to what happened in their lives that shaped and molded who they are, how they respond, who were the adults who were in their lives, what were their supports. And so we're looking at it from the standpoint of what happens with children and what it does to them, but in relation to how it molded us as adults, like how we got where we got, how we are who we are today. And we talked, in the last slide about each child's response to trauma is going to be different. It's not going to always look the same. And just understanding a child's perception of what happened is just as important as what actually occurred. So from an adult standpoint, a child's looking at things through a different lens. Their scope of experience is different. And so if you as a child perceive harm, The perception is the reality. So if I perceive harm to my emotional, to my physical, that is just as important as what happens. And so we have to remember that, because that perception is what shapes them. That perception is what alters their brain. Because as we said when we were defining it, it is that intense and overwhelming experience that involves serious loss, threat, or harm to a person's physical and or emotional well-being. So if I just perceive this to be harmful, I perceive that this person's hurting me, that makes a difference. If I perceive the situation as dangerous, it makes a difference. It absolutely does. So some examples of traumatic life experiences, as we're talking about childhood trauma, we have physical, emotional, and or sexual abuse. And this can happen, of course, when we're talking about trauma in general, in adulthood, but we're like today talking about in childhood. Also, neglect or abandonment. So food insufficiency, so not having enough food. This is traumatic. These are traumatic events and situations. Lack of money to meet basic needs. Homelessness is traumatic. The death of a parent, absolutely traumatic. So when I think about just everything going on right now, and people, we've lost 500 plus thousand people, and I'm probably, the number is much higher than that, and I'm misquoting the figure, but just a lot of people have left behind children. The loss of a parent, especially when you're a child and not really understanding. Adults don't understand that, and the brevity of life and why, and we don't understand it. Just kind of think about children and what they go through, not really understanding. Divorce can be very traumatic. A lot happens. Adults, you watching this, think about when your parents, if your parents were together and separated or divorced, the changes. In some cases, not seeing that parent again, or that division, or if there was discord between the parents, I've heard of stories of divorce happening, and then one parent is now the primary caregiver, but then there's the food insufficiency, the lack of money to meet basic needs. So going through all of that. Family members addicted to drugs, alcoholism. If you have an incarcerated parent, and we know the statistics when it comes to Black and incarceration, specifically Black males in the system, and we know what that looks like, and it's very traumatic. So when the prison system, and if our prisons are full with people who look like us, there are children that look like us that don't have their parents. So thinking about that, traumatic. Rape, being raped, absolutely. Rape, sexual assault, all traumatic. Serious medical illness or disease, it's like, so loss of function for the body, loss of limbs, anything invasive or distressing. There are many children with different ailments, different illnesses that have had to have multiple surgeries or treatments, and as a child, and that is very, very traumatic. They're not understanding. Kids want to play with their peers. They want to play with their toys. They want to watch TV. They want to play games. So things of these natures are can be very, very traumatic, and cause a lot of harm, especially emotional harm to them. And then now I had to add this piece on, as we're talking about all of this, life in a pandemic, traumatic. Life in a pandemic, children not being able to go to school, not being able to interact with their peers, see their families, as I stated earlier, with the death toll of COVID-19, you have children who don't have their parents. I've heard of so many stories of children left behind, life completely changing. So it'll be very, very interesting to see when we come out of this one day, right? When we're talking about the impact of trauma, what will it look like? What will the children look like as adults who experienced this pandemic, who were living through it, who couldn't go to school for over a year, who dealt with food insufficiencies and their parents losing their jobs and having to be evicted or leaving their homes, because of lack of money and resources. So life in a pandemic. And we know, once again, we know that this pandemic disproportionately impacts Black people. We know that. So we're talking about just trauma. And I said in that last slide, trauma is common, especially in our community. How it is a global pandemic, right? So many are impacted. And as we see in the United States, there's a disproportionate impact for us. So it's when it drizzles or rains, it pours down on us. We get the negative impact. It's already a very negative, detrimental, devastating situation that this world is in right now with this virus. But we see that in the United States, we are disproportionately impacted by it. Very traumatic. So like I said, very curious to see what this will look like for our children today when they become adults. Just thinking back to like when I talked about Jim Crow and segregation, the civil rights movement, everything that was going on. So I'm wondering, and I don't even have to wonder because we can watch countless interviews and hear accounts from adults who are now adults who were children during those times and what it was like for them. Just to hear, for the perfect example, over 100 years ago, we have now the Tulsa Massacre, and the Tulsa Massacre survivor, who's 107 years old, giving her testimony. She was 7 years old at that time of what the impact was, what happened. So it's just interesting, and we don't think about this often. When traumatic events happen, what happens to that child? What adult do they become? What is the impact? So just thinking of those, it's over 100 years now, but thinking about those children who lost their parents, who were in a community that was decimated, the devastation of that. And so ultimately, just today's conversation, again, just connecting childhood, where it all began, and how does it shape and mold us as an adult. So I'm going to give some more examples of traumatic experiences, and I want to highlight just briefly acts of terrorism. And so when I say acts of terrorism, I want to highlight, underline, italicize, and bold acts of terrorism as we see from very recently domestic terrorism as well. So we don't want to have the face of terrorism be what it is not. Right now, what we are experiencing, even during a pandemic, we are witnessing a lot of domestic terrorism. So we have to think about that. That is traumatic. And so witnessing or experiencing community violence. So I want to give some more examples of that. Trauma. So think about, in the context, it's already, once again, hard for us adults. You are a child, and You go to school and there are school shootings. There are hundreds of them that occur. That's traumatic for you, even if it's not your school, let alone the students who go to that school, those schools. Think about a child just watching the news and schools are being shot up. That's traumatic because now there's a threat or harm to my physical and my emotional, my mental well-being because I'm a kid and I go to school. Will that be my school? And so those are life experiences, like I said, let alone the impact of those who physically go to those schools. The trauma, what happened to them? Community violence, right? Shootings, killings, gang violence. I'll touch upon also, what about I was a child, growing up, going to church, my parents taking me, I sang in the choir, I went to Bible study. And so church, where your parents take you to be safe, to be protected, to grow your spirituality. And then you hear about Mother Emanuel Church and your child changes your scope of thinking about church, possibly. So these are things that are traumatic. You have a family member that is a victim of one of these situations I named. And so that's traumatic. They're a victim of that. Another example connected to the act of terrorism, domestic terrorism. Someone coming into a supermarket. I'm watching the news. My mom or dad's watching the news. Or I was in the supermarket. I go to the supermarket with my mom and dad. It's no longer a safe space. I can't go to the supermarket. Or those parents with children in the supermarket having to decide what to do. Or now the conversation is changing because now I'm a parent and I'm like, my child likes to go into the next aisle and grab cereal, but maybe now I can't let them do that. And so now my whole dynamic of how I'm parenting is different because I have to make sure that they're in my sight and then we have an action plan for if something happens. Traumatic is that threat there, that looming threat. So just wanted to give some examples. So not only for the people of those situations who are in it, who are survivors, who by the grace of God got to walk out of those places alive, who walked out of the supermarket, who got to walk out of the schools, but now facing trauma. Now having to deal with what happens when there's that threat, that serious loss, that harm, having to deal with that. So I said earlier, I gave some examples of how trauma is common and how for our community especially. So racism, racial trauma. So racial trauma is the ongoing, and I'm going to highlight, italicize bold, what I always say, the ongoing result of racism, racist bias, exposure to racist abuse in the media, the exposure of it. Racial trauma can affect many aspects of your life, including your relationships, concentrating on schoolwork, feeling safe, or concentrating on school or work, feeling safe. And so just once again, highlighting the media part and what we're watching, what we're witnessing, ongoing, and just how difficult that is. So now I am a parent and my conversation with my child looks different. It looks different. What do I say to them? How do I explain to a child what happened to Tamir Rice? who was, my child wants a water gun or a toy. How do I explain Trayvon Martin? How do I explain now we got to physically watch George Floyd being murdered over and over again? How do I have the conversation as a parent about the police? We call 911. I remember as a child learning, making sure you know your address and making sure you know your parent's phone number, and you got to know 911, because if you need help, that's who's coming to help you. That conversation is now looking a little bit different, and it doesn't mean that calling 911 you can't get help. Absolutely does not mean that. I have called 911. I've been in car accidents, had to call them, and have had great experiences with getting support. But the conversation still looks different. So I'm a child, and I am now witnessing, and we know from the murder of George Floyd, from even the case, the trial rather, we know that there were young people, children who were witnesses. Traumatic. Remember, now I'm now a child and I'm witnessing something. I might be able to see my father there, or that might be my uncle, or that could be me. And then now I have confusion because I say, police, call 911 when you need help. But now I'm witnessing this, and I know a man lost his life. And so racial trauma, when I say the media, and we're constantly being exposed to being harmed and watching it and taking it in. And this has been our story. It just looks different now because of the fact now we have we have technology, and we have phones, and we have video camera. We have different things. We had some things before. We were able to. I remember being a child during the riots that went on in LA, and there were some technology capabilities. People had cameras and things, but there's nothing now. Things are not going viral. Like, it's just a different world we're living in. There's constant exposure to the trauma, to seeing us be harmed, hurt, killed, abused over and over and over again. It's an ongoing thing. So it's not a new thing. Harm to our Black bodies is not new. There were children. Like I said, the Tulsa massacre was a perfect example of there were children. When we lost those people, those prominent, just great, wonderful people, many of them had families, they had children. And so ultimately, racial trauma, witnessing the constant bias, even being, we talked about before, microaggressions, just which I heard someone refer to microaggressions, those slight death by 1,000 cuts. So to someone, it's like, not a big deal. But for you, it's cuts, just constant digs, jabs at who you are as a person, slight harm, constant poking, digging at you, piece by piece till you're broken down. And so the ongoing result of racist bias and trauma, and that exposure to that daily, that threat to your well-being, to feel like I'm nothing, that like, will that happen to me, mom or dad, when I start driving? Like, or that conversation when your Black son is so excited to drive, and you were excited. I remember wanting to drive so badly, and how excited I was to turn 17 and get my road test and go to school, because you leave early, get your road test. I came back to have my license. And so just the conversation is different for that child who now has to have a conversation about, I want you to be able to drive, son or daughter, but I want you to be able to come home safe and in one piece. And so it is just the impact. So when we talk about childhood trauma, we have to understand what our children are witnessing, what they're going through, how they're seeing children and adults be harmed that look like them and what that does to them, and their constant exposure to it. Feeling like you can't be safe, you can't focus. How do I focus once again in school? How, if I'm in the school building? I know things are very different because we're in this pandemic and many kids are being educated at home, but how do I focus if I knew my parents had the television on this morning and I heard about a school shooting? How do I go to school and just and not connect that could be my school? I remember working in a school and we would do the drills, which were very, very, they could be beneficial because you want to be prepared, but we had to do drills. So I often thought about the idea of we had to practice if we had an intruder in the school, something I never had to do as a child in school. But we would practice if there was like a natural disaster, like a hurricane, and where to stand in the building. But we would also practice if there was an intruder in the building. And I remember one of our practice times, we would have it where we after the school shootings would occurred rather, and we just it was schools in the area had to like get it together, get a plan. And we had in our windows of the classrooms of the building and in the offices as well, we had like a Velcro covering the window. And so ultimately, you can open it up, but then when these situations happen, you can cover it so no one can see inside. And I remember practicing, and the school got a student to, I guess pretend to during the drill, and the other students didn't know, be out in the hallway. And I remember we were told if there's an intruder and we had the drill, the doors closed, and we were notified that someone was in the building to cause harm, you had to lock your door, put the Velcro piece of paper in front of the window, and do not open it. And so ultimately, the students didn't know that they got a student earlier in the day to, I guess, go to the restroom during that time, and then had to bang on the door to be let in. But then we weren't allowed to open the door. So the students got to experience that we couldn't open the door for the one student because there was 20 in the room. And if the intruder was with that one student and had them knock on the door, we were not allowed to open the door for that one student, that one life that's precious, just like the other 20 in the room were. But it was all just like a simulated, experience. But just to think that your child goes to the bathroom, or those children just not understanding, like, she can't come, we can't open the door for her. Because if someone was coming in our school to harm us, we couldn't open the doors because we have to keep 20 people safe. But just these conversations that we are having, these experiences that we're having with children seeing murder, hearing about it, hearing even that COVID disproportionately impacts them. It's just a lot. It's a lot. And so how do we help them? Because they're now growing up and they're going to be adults that are impacted at the point of where it all began. That's why today's conversation is about where it all began. It starts at that point, and it doesn't just end there. Even if it's a single event situation, it can mold and change. But when it's ongoing, like racism, racial trauma, ongoing, every day I'm witnessing something, I'm hearing something, someone thinks I'm less than. I mean, I'm out with my parents and someone yelled out the window the N-word, constant, ongoing. I'm a child. What do they think of me? Are they going to harm me? Constant. So how may experiencing trauma in childhood affect a person? Let's talk a little bit about that. And so I wanted to just briefly go over this just to kind of give some context to give context through this study, and not to hone in on the study itself, but just to make the connection of what trauma can do. So there was a study, and it was called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And basically what it was is it was ran by the Center for Disease Control, CDC, and Kaiser Permanente, and they collaborated. And it was a 10-year study, 17,000 people. And in terms of the makeup, the racial makeup of the people, I don't know if this study was a representation enough of people that look like us, but just in general to make the connection. I know we talked about racial trauma, just making the connection of how things that are traumatic in your childhood can impact you. We will give context to the examples, but I wanted to just bring up this study to show that this will bring the context to what happens when children have these experiences and what it does to them in adulthood. So basically, it looked at the effects of any adverse experience in childhood trauma over the lifespan. So like when these traumatic events happen, and over the lifespan, through the years, what the impact was. And it's the largest study that's ever done on a topic of this nature. So basically, the study, what they found was that the risk for mental and physical health problems from a past trauma, it goes up with the number of events, traumatic events that are experienced by a child. So if there are 3 or more experiences, there's a greater risk for those adverse impact or reaction or that harm to them. So impact of the trauma over a lifespan, what it does or what it looks like is there's neurological, biological, and psychological impacts. And they're also social in nature. So when I say the social part, we think about how it impacts. We know neurological, with the brain. We know biological with the body, psychological with our thinking, how we behave, and social in relation to relationships, how we interact in the world, in environment. And so there's changes in your brain neurobiology, how your nervous system functions from trauma. Trauma changes the brain. Trauma changes the brain. And we know that it could be, once again, social, emotional, and cognitive impairments from trauma over the lifespan. So what this study found or made the connection with these traumatic events, they found over a person's lifespan that they adopted. And I said this earlier, how sometimes when you're overwhelmed by those experiences, your coping skills aren't the greatest. So there's a lot of short-term relief that is that a person has or goes to that in the long term has more harm. So we have, like, as a result, they saw eating disorders, smoking, substance abuse, self-harm, sexual promiscuity, violence, and severe and persistent behavioral health issues and social problems. And then in a lot of cases, early death. So as I said earlier, trauma impacts the brain. As a child, the brain is constantly developing. And I gave that example earlier of how it impacts a child, traumatic experiences or an experience, birth to 5. But as a child, the brain is constantly developing. The brain, as they describe it, is like, as a child, plastic. Not literally plastic, but when we think about something plastic, like a plastic bag, we can move it, mold it, it can change. And basically, when we say the brain is plastic, it's for those reasons. And it basically is saying that the brain can change based upon not just positive experiences. Positive experiences are great and they can have that impact, but also through negative experiences. And when we go through a traumatic situation, when a child does, especially when it's an ongoing situation, the brain operates in survival mode. Remember that hypervigilance state, that survival mode. I have to make sure I'm good. It's like the brain is like, I gotta watch my back. I gotta be, because when the traumatic situation or situations snuck up on me or got me, I wasn't ready. I'm ready now. So it's that hypervigilance, and I gotta survive. I gotta make it. The brain does that. The brain operates in that mode. So I know us as adults, just thinking back to how we are, what everything that's going on now that I explained that children are going through. Like, think about this. I want you to reflect as I'm saying these things. Reflect on you. Reflect on how you respond to things, where it comes from. So we have that fight, flight, freeze mode. So as I said, trauma, survival brain. Survival. Got to make it. Got to survive. Trauma changing the brain. And so trauma is living in your nervous system. And the part of the nervous system is called the autonomic nervous system. And so when there's that perceived threat, perceived, operative word, perceived, we're operating in fight, flight, or freeze. You have that response. You're either ready to take it on, ready to go, or you're like, and you're frozen. And it may not, I gave that dramatic, response. It doesn't literally mean all the time you can physically freeze, but it is just like doing nothing. Like you don't know what to do. So think about situations in adulthood where your response is either I fight. When somebody, when somebody does something to me, this is how I respond. I've worked with people that we're trying to figure out, why is it when I feel threatened in the conversation, I go to cursing and yelling and get it, and they're trying to figure it out. And then as we're processing, we're connecting to what they had to do in childhood, what happened to them, what occurred to make them this way. Where did this start? Where did it all begin? And so the responses, fight, flight, freeze, are not planned at all. They're not planned. They're not controlled. You're not planning. Okay, so that's why it's so interesting to me when people are even saying, if I were to face XYZ danger, I'm going to do this. You don't know what you're going to do. Because that nervous system response, that autonomic nervous system, that response to that threat, that danger, that trauma, it's not planned or controlled. You don't know if you fight, or you're freezing. You don't know. So there is a great impact on that brain. So when we see multiple traumatic experiences, and remember, I just touched on that study to say, with that study, these are things that they found that this is what occurs. If there's 3 or more situations, and basically it's a list of questions, and the questions ask you about different events that occurred, and then you basically give yourself, you give yourself a 1 if you had this happen or this traumatic event, and then it gives context to, if you have 3 or more, you're at greater risk, for certain adverse impact or effect. So when there are multiple traumatic experiences, we might see, anxiety problems and fears happening, physical health problems. And we can look at this in correlation to the heart disease. Because think about the hypervigilance we talked about, the heart racing, having to go through this constant hypervigilant state where heart is beating fast, adrenaline's pumping, always on guard. That body revving up and down like a car. If you rev up your car constantly, it will mess up your engine. So the same thing, our body's revved up, just ready. We're not supposed to be in that constant state. So when we're experiencing constant traumatic experiences, there's going to be anxiety, physical health problems. So we talked about, a couple of months back when women, that strong Black woman trope, and just like not taking care of themselves and not being believed at the doctor's office and just suffering physically from those things, that high blood pressure, that cholesterol, right? All things that once again disproportionately impact Black people. The heart issues, sleep problems, having a hard time sleeping, and just emotional problems, the feeling numb. So we often think with trauma that you feel. Sometimes people can't feel anything. They're longing to feel. They can't feel. There's emotional, they don't feel that pain. They're numb. Disconnected from oneself or environment, we call it dissociation, just being disassociated and disconnected just from people. It can in the environment, it could be the environment itself, the people in the environment, just not connected to it at all. And it's just trying to cope in ways that aren't healthy, and memory issues, and just understanding that what it does to the body. That's why it's just so important of what we do, how we care for ourselves, how we take care of ourselves. Our trauma response is so important. And then, a lot of flashbacks, just going back to the events. And so these are things that are a result of having multiple traumatic experiences. So when you have, once again, multiple traumatic experiences, it raises the risk for, and we talked about this a few minutes ago, just alcoholism and substance abuse, obesity, respiratory difficulties, heart disease, we talked about, just promiscuity, right? Multiple sexual partners, poor relationships in general, struggling to have relationships, smoking, and suicidal ideation, suicidal attempts, and then unintended pregnancies. Let's think about a lot of just like teenage pregnancies, or just not really feeling adequate or worthy or care for your body, or just looking for connection in people, and there's so much. Trauma may also lead to PTSD, where, reliving experiences over and over again. Avoidance, as we talked about, and numbing feelings, trying to avoidance, and just not wanting to feel anything or struggling to feel. And I talked about the state of hypervigilance, just always being on guard, or just ready, being on ready, as they call it. Someone's on ready. And in our community, in the Black community, we often feel this way. We often feel a sense of hypervigilance, where we don't know. We're walking into situations, we don't know, am I encountering racist people, or people who think like this in me? Is someone trying to get over? Is someone going to try to harm me? We're constantly that way. Oh, I'm in a situation, I'm at work, and no one looks like me. Are they going to do something to me? Do they think less of me? Are they going to try to get me out of this position because I'm the only Black woman? There is so much. There's so much. So once again, going back to that study, and just the point of bringing up the study is to look at these adverse experiences. A lot of them started in childhood. And so it is important to see and know the connection of, when I have these adverse childhood experiences over my lifetime, how does it impact me physically, emotionally, and mentally? We cannot say, oh, they were just 7 when they, were in that situation. There's an impact. There's a place these things began, and it does impact you. When we see oversensitivity, irritability, right, it goes with that hypervigilance. Just you don't feel good, not feeling good. The trauma response is so intense, and we can call it everything else, but we got to look at where it all began, what makes us behave the way that we behave, and why are we who we are, what molded and shaped us, what experiences. When a flower doesn't bloom, I found this quote and I loved it. When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows in and not the flower. We can't really fix the flower. So it's not about fixing the child. We need to change. We need to think about changing the environment we have our children in. We need to think about changing the circumstance. We don't need that child to be different because they're experiencing racism. We need racism not to happen. We need people to take a look at their heart and how they're treating others, or what systems are in place that harm others that don't look like them. So it's not about changing the person, like they're broken or something's wrong with them. It's about that environment. It's about making a situation where our children are in a healthy environment. So a lot of times when, we are thinking of ourselves in adulthood and everything we experience and our struggles, and a lot of times going through traumatic experiences, going through loss and pain, we often think less of ourselves. We feel incompetent sometimes. We feel less than. We feel unloved. We feel like we need fixing and there's something wrong with us, when really our environment needs to be different. So we got to think about the environment, the change of things around us. What can we do? So we got to think about the idea of wanting our environment to be better, wanting to create better environments for ourselves, better situations for our children. So we understand trauma better and, are more not hyper vigilant, but vigilant in making sure that, for example, we said abuse in the media. So making sure the exposure to those things are limited, and making sure that our conversations are developmentally appropriate, making sure that we're putting the proper supports in place for our children. So what can we do? I just said a little bit there, but I'm going to give a little bit more of what can be done in these situations. So we talked about childhood trauma, what racial trauma can do, but what can we do? First, it's about acknowledging the trauma. Acknowledge what happened. We don't want to live in shame. We don't want to live in guilt. We don't want to live in fear. If you were involved in a traumatic experience or experiences growing up, I'm here to let you know that whatever happened to you is never your fault. We're children. When we're children, we don't have a lot of control over what we do. And so ultimately acknowledging what happened to you. You don't have to live in that feeling. The only way to change it is to acknowledge it. The second thing I think is important is getting the support that is needed. If you don't like how you respond to situations, or the examples I gave, you're an adult and you experience a lot of, you're numb, you can't feel, you struggle to feel, or you feel too much and you're heightened and hypervigilant, and you know that you don't feel good. You don't feel like you're living the quality of life that you're living, that you're supposed to live. Get the support that is needed. There are especially trained trauma therapists who focus on trauma, and I know for a fact from my own experiences, who specifically have strategies and ways to hold space for you not only as a person experiencing trauma, but as a Black person experiencing trauma, because your trauma looks different. How you experienced it looks different, but they're there to hold space. And so that your experience in a therapeutic environment is culturally sensitive and it's supportive to who you are in your experience. It's not watered down. So those people exist. They're there to hold space for you, not to tell you, don't feel like that, or are you sure it happened that way, or make you feel like you're wrong and something happened to you. So if you're needing support, please seek it out. And whatever that support may be, that's healthy. Practice radical self-care, caring for yourself, especially you're an adult. We talked about trauma, what childhood trauma was. You're understanding adverse childhood experiences, and you took that adverse childhood experience questionnaire, and you're really coming to terms with how many traumatic experiences you had. And so just making sure as you're healing that you are practicing radical self-care. You're caring for yourself as much as possible. I'm not talking about spas and that's fine, or massages. Absolutely go for that. But I'm talking about wholeheartedly taking care of yourself, practicing mindfulness, getting that support that you need, taking care of you physically, mentally, emotionally. Reminding yourself that there's nothing wrong with you, and that what happened to you in your life, the things that you experienced as a child that were negative and adverse, were not your fault. We need to look towards our community, because there is strength in our community. There are resources, there's support. There are people like us. We don't have to be in shame, because there are people like us. If we experience sexual abuse, there are groups. There are people in our community that look like us that have groups. There are churches that run programs with people like us, where people share their testimony and what they experience and get support. And they don't have to feel the shame, because you look across the pew and someone that looks like you had a similar experience in trauma. So look towards your community for resources, for support. Have compassion for self and others. So we're going to switch gears to the idea of what is wrong with you, and look at what happened to you. We're constantly looking at people, especially kids. We see a kid behaving a certain way or having a response. They don't respond like us. They're different. And we're looking at like, what is wrong with that little boy? What's wrong with you? We need to switch it to what happened to you. Something happened. Where did it all begin? The title of today's conversation. Where did it all begin that shapes and molds you to who you are today? So we need to have practice compassion for ourselves and compassion for others. It doesn't mean we give people a pass to do whatever they want, but everyone has a story. And trauma absolutely shapes and molds the brain. It changes our response, how we operate. And if we don't get the proper support or have the proper supports in place and begin to heal from it and work through it, acknowledge it, the number one thing, that it happened. And then we're in this place where all of those little boxes I had of all of those things happening, those adverse effects, those negative impacts, we don't want that to be us. And if that is us, then we want to work towards getting support so that we can have some change. Support can be in the community, can also be in your family as well. Supportive family members. So remember, not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. I talked earlier about limiting the exposure for children and for us of the media, and taking those things in. You can absolutely be an activist, and if you're wanting to be an activist, finding what works for you. And it doesn't mean taking in the harshness of violence in the media and just seeing us be abused constantly. You can't take that in all the time. Just limiting exposure or taking breaks as needed. And so now we're going to go into our reflection activity. And so today's journal prompt is this is what I want you to do. Because we said trauma just changes everything about how we think, how we behave. I want you to write about a negative thought that you have held on to as a result of a traumatic experience or a trauma. Sometimes we hold on to thoughts and we know they are not true, but they are like, we hold tight to them. We have this perception. Sometimes, especially if somebody abuses, harms you, and you feel like it's my fault or something's wrong with me, we hold on to that, and it's not true. But we hold on to that because of how someone treats me. This is who I am. This is what I am, and those thoughts are not true. So I want you to, as you grab your journal and your pen, sit and reflect on this thought, that negative thought. We don't want to hold tight, but reflect on it, and then write about all the reasons that this is not true. So write out what that thought you've been holding on to as a result of your traumatic or negative experience that you've had. And then I want you to, after you write that thought down, write all the reasons it's not true. I want you then to write what is true about who you are and where you would like to be in your life. What is true? So the negative thought as a result of the negative experience, reflect on that, and all of the reasons it really is not true. And I want you to write then about who are you? What is true about who you are? And where you would like to be. And that doesn't have to be connected to how much money I have, what job, what this, what that, but just who are you? Just sit and reflect on that. Because a lot of times that traumatic experience will have us not knowing who we are, not knowing ourselves, not thinking or understanding our value or worth. Happy journaling. I know it's I say happy because to reflect and grow and to learn is it's a good thing. It absolutely is a good thing. So just making sure that you're doing that. So we are at the end of our time. I thank you for joining me today and hearing this conversation about where it all began. I'm looking forward to the next 3 weeks, our conversation, unpacking that racial identity, racial trauma, the impact, and looking at what that is and what that looks like for us. So as always, take care of yourself, take care of each other, and be well. Bye-bye.